Welcome to the BeyondX podcast. I'm your host, Mahir Brahimi, and every week I speak to leading industry experts, trailblazers, and market leaders where we discuss the key topics of our time in detail and have a deep dive conversation on areas like sustainability, technology, urban planning and city design, health and fitness, and more. In today's episode of Beyond Tech, I spoke with Dr. Professor Derek Woodgate, where we covered key topics like AI, smart cities, BCI, accessibility of tech, and the key fundamental requirements for essentially setting these technologies up and making the most of them for the future. But at the core of our conversation was a key fact that technology only serves as an enabler for key visions. And the most important thing to keep in mind when thinking to the future is to keep the human centric journey at the core of all the decision making. The different discussion points are all timestamped throughout the episode, so you can freely move around as you see fit. Derek is a consulting futurist, educator, author, speaker, and curator. He's the president and chief futurist at the Futures Lab Inc. in the US, a foresight consultancy he founded in 1996, which specializes in creating future potential for major corporations and institutions. Derek holds multiple teaching roles at various universities, including the University of Agder in Norway, the University of Houston College of Technology Foresight program, where he teaches grad students in applied foresight, and the Prince Mohammed bin Fahd University in Saudi Arabia, where he is an advisor to the vice president on academic affairs. Derek was recently appointed to the executive board of the Center for Future Studies at the University of Dubai and is also a member of the World Future Studies Federation, head of the UNESCO Committee on the subject, and a founding member of the Association of Professional Futurists. Derek has worked on numerous international integrated city development projects at the government, regional, and local levels. Some of his past work include as an advisor to the US government on the Future of Transportation and Infrastructure 2050 plan, the UAE Ministry of Interior on security, policing, traffic, and civil defense, the UN and UNESCO on the advancement of future literacy for societal improvement, the Ministries of Education of both Norway and Germany introducing transdisciplinarity for societal transformation, the Texas state government on the 30-year development plan of the future of Austin, the Central Texas Technology Corridor, and the cultural development of the city of Austin, as well as the future of energy tech for city development, the Malaysian government on the integration of creatives into the 30-year Kuala Lumpur development plan, the City of London for the repurposing of Covent Garden and the future vision for Silicon Roundabouts. And its corporate clients have included Microsoft, Intel, Coca-Cola, Philips, Ford, Fiat, Kellogg's, Nestle, Henkel, Nokia, Intercontinental Hotels, MTV, Nissan, BBC, Shell, Hugo Boss, and many more. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Professor Derek Woodgate. It's a pleasure to be here with you finally on the episode.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I think it's going to be an action-packed episode, so I'm going to try to keep things as concise as I can. I want to start things off before we get into the technical topics by asking you how you got into futurism, what moved you towards this field, and essentially how did this journey begin for you?
I came from corporate. I was the senior VP at the VF Corporation, responsible actually for global strategy. And the last years of that, we were engaged very extensively in investments. It was the beginnings of globalization, so investments into factories in countries that most people not heard of, into technologies and structures and new ways of doing things that really were transformative for the industry at the time. And part of my role was to understand the risks that were involved in these types of investments or this type of shifts. These were it was going from fairly conventional ways of producing and manufacturing things predominantly within their own US and European manufacturing environments, into areas that were politically fairly unstable, economically unstable in many cases. And where you make those types of investments, you need a 15-year understanding at least of what the potential is you want to go in and pull out. And so I started doing that more like long-term strategic planning and realized that wasn't good enough And I started reading books, particularly that I now know from fairly well-known colleagues, about this field called future studies, which I'd never heard of, to be honest. And it gave me an insight into a completely new way of thinking about the future. Moreover, I found a book called, it was called Emerging Technologies for 2057. It was in 1997. So it was a really long-term vision, a cross between sci-fi, university, lab developments, and wishful thinking. But it was very interesting. And it's also a book by Richard Slaughter called New Thinking for the New Millennium. Obviously, I got a very good cross-section of what was happening. So I began to study that. And then when I formed the Futures Lab, clearly it was not based on true future studies at the time because I wasn't that familiar, but it had a lot of those elements. And I think coming from a large corporation at a high level allowed me to do that. And luckily, my first client was VF. They wanted me to come back and do some work for them through Gray International, a company. And I was very lucky because Gray, who had been the agency for VF at the time, just set up a futures company. Not again, not real future studies as we know it now, but along that line. And for the first 5 years of my company, a lot of that work came through Gray. And as they're one of the largest agencies in the world, so their clients were phenomenal. And so my startup in all this was working with some of the world's largest companies that really pushed me into the field in a real, very direct and very demanding way. So I just had to learn very fast. And yeah, I read more and more, spoke to people, became a member of the World Future Studies Federation, which allowed me to meet other people. Yeah, and that's basically where it all started.
That's quite a long journey, isn't it? From strategy to futurism, especially essentially at the inception of the field. So it'd be great if you could give us a detail of what it is that you consider to be a futurist, and more importantly, what the day to day of a futurist essentially is. What are the different types of work that you undertake?
So whatever I say will be a perfect platform for arguments from anyone that's a futurist or not a futurist. But I'll give you my definition based on, I think, let's say the work that I do, the theories that I've developed, and the techniques and processes that I follow and have developed, because I've developed my own over the years, obviously. I was at a conference, Association Professional Futurist Conference, and there were three of us on stage, and we were asked to actually give a definition of what we consider the futurist. And mine was, at the time, and it's still a tagline for the Futures Lab, which is developing or creating future potential. They said, could you give an elevator speech on it? So mine was like 4 words. And the next person came on, and someone in the middle of it said, we were not talking about an elevator in the Twin Towers. And I think that, in a sense, that was Power for the Cause reflects upon your question in many ways, that everyone will have their own somewhat. But what I feel is more the question of what are some of the critical elements that define it, which probably is easier in a way to understand. So one of them is I think that I work with what's called unstructured knowledge in unknown worlds. Okay, so I'm working with a lot of weak signals. I'm working with a lot of sci-fi ideas that are actually being developed in back labs in universities and whatever for one purpose. I can actually see a totally different purpose for. And if I merge that with something that also is just about being developed, I can find something else. And so it's about really creating. And so much of the time, when people say, what do you do? I would say, I create the future. And they say, well, that's really pretentious. And I say, yes, it is very pretentious. But I could say reframing ideas to create the future or whatever you want me to say. But at the end of the day, if I don't feel I'm doing that, and that I'm creating that future for the betterment of society and for the well-being of society, then really I'm not doing anything. I'm playing with strategies and sort of ideas, and I'm not really doing it with a real deep purpose. What it involves in many ways is discontinuity. This whole idea where it differs from forecasting and other fields of long-term strategic planning, in the sense that it's not about evolving from the present. Yes, of course, we have to understand what happened in the past, near past, and so on and so forth, and the present. But once you've done that, it really is about discontinuity. It's understanding that actually it's not about an evolution today. A good example of this is if 20 years ago or so, someone would have said, how will banking look in the future? You would not think about internet banking in digital currencies. That was not even vaguely in people's minds 20 years ago. And since I'm looking usually 15, 20 years out, I need to understand that type of, that's real discontinuous change. They potentially say, could banks be open longer? Then we had ATMs and they were worried about whether they lose their money. But we've moved so far in the 20 odd years from what banking literally was. That's what I would say is what a futurist does, is having that ability to understand, analyze, understand, and create those types of novelties, but functional novelties. But there are a lot of things behind it. We talk about anticipation systems, we talk about all these new types of thinking, recoding thinking techniques. There are a lot of different things to it make that happen. And you cannot, generally speaking, use totally linear thinking to achieve it. It's much more of a combination of linear and non-linear thinking, or divergent and convergent thinking systems together. So part of my real interest in this, and part of my contribution to the field over the years, has been coming up with new thinking systems, new thinking techniques, new creative techniques, new ways of dealing with that.
Interesting. So, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's essentially estimating to some degree what will happen in the future, contingency planning for that to some degree, and then future proofing to ensure that we have the skills, technologies, whatever else is required to meet those needs and demands.
And now we see these two different areas. I don't actually believe that they're fully two different areas, future studies and foresight. One being that future studies is the broader field of research into the potential future, whereas foresight really is a process potentially used not just by business, a lot of it's actually by institutions, business organizations, to actually develop scenarios and a very specific implementation plans, or even to the way that we actually work, which is even stages beyond that, where we're actually creating project ideas, we're creating organizational change developments for that. So it goes even further. So depending what you do, a lot of futurists, though, people claiming to be futurists, will say, no, I do futurist literacy workshops, anticipatory study workshops, and we come up with potential ideas about the future. And that can take a day or 6 hours or whatever. Whereas my projects take anything between 4 months and a year or more. So it's a really different type of work. I think that, yes, you're right. Some of it's about future proofing. Certainly that for the companies is predominantly about, partly about future proofing and anticipating change, understanding how to play with transformative change, which most people are not good at doing that. And how do you get that through the organization? Other work, I work for a number of ministries, is much more about the broader picture of understanding, for example, where can education be 15 years from now, institutionalized education, online education, any formats of education, self-learning, brain implants, or anything else that can come into that, because it can be very different of how we see an environment for learning in the future. I work for the Ministry of Interior. Obviously, there I'm looking at future security, future policing, both global and national structures for ensuring that we are able to maintain a safe and well-being society, whereby that's critical. And that takes a lot of different aspects, because it's looking at all aspects of, if it's policing, from investigative policing to new weaponry to new penal systems, or whatever it happens to be. I mean, it's very broad areas. And clearly, it takes a long time to understand, on an individual basis, how these could potentially be transformed into, well, what's the integration of all those? Do we even need prisons in the future? Do we need police in the future? So these are big questions, and they're not something you can really do in a 3-day workshop. There's something that's very much about going through a deep analytical system and multiple 30 to 40 techniques, whether it's linear thinking technique, creative thinking techniques, or whatever, to really keep pushing down and understanding at multiple levels of various perspectives of this, and then breaking those down even further into really small bits to understand what they really mean and could mean, and what impact they would have on, whether it's impact on the institution or impact on society in general, whether it's feasible, whether it's flexible, all these aspects. What's your gut feel about it at the end of the day? So the intuitive aspects as well. Moreover, they cover every single industry, every type of industry, from intel to fashion. And they also cover every type of organization. So whether it's corporate, institutional, education, institutional ministries, or whatever, non-profits. So all of that's included in that process, and each of them needs to be approached somewhat differently, which is why we have these different approach structures and multiple techniques and tools.
Makes perfect sense. I think that's as good an explanation as could be expected. The key thing that comes to my mind is you can't talk about the future without talking about AI. Obviously, it's always a hot topic. You mentioned it a couple of times, ChatGPT and all the potential things that they can do now. It's something that everyone talks about these days, but I think before we really dive deep into what AI can mean for us, we need to define it a bit. I personally had a lot of trouble having a conversation with certain people who are not really involved in the technology side of things about just what is considered AI. And obviously, it can range from something as simple as a basic algorithm or smartphone to automated vehicles and machines to a self sustaining, self efficient, self reliant, supreme intelligence. So I would say let's start things off by defining AI based on your definition, of course, and what range of technologies and concepts you would put within the remit of artificial intelligence.
Well, it's a discipline that went back, I think, to 1950s, 56 or something like that. So as you can imagine, over that period of time, both the interpretation of what it is and what it actually is, and how we think about it and apply it has shifted dramatically. Still, though, at the end of the day, it's intelligence demonstrated by machines as opposed to humans and other animals. So the question really is, how do we do that? What is that? It's software, ultimately. And you're right, it's algorithms. And of course, it's those algorithms, or fall into platforms, or call them, drive different types of ways of doing things. And you mentioned machine learning and deep learning, which are two, obviously, but we have the vision, we have NLP, and there's a whole lot of different aspects to this, robotics. They all come under that. And I think that's part of the reason why there's a slight difficulty in the way we're challenged to think about it, is because, in a sense, it is part of our everyday life, so much so because we use AI and everything. This is full of it. Everything else we have is full of it. So, of course, at the end of the day, there'll be multiple interpretations of what it is. Ultimately, it is literally, as it is, machine intelligence. And what it is. And I think it's defined beyond that by what it does, its applications, and whether it's being used to, we're talking about from an optimizational perspective and thinking about it from modeling human problems, or whether we're solving human problems, or whether we're looking at it as a large database of knowledge that we can then create something from and analyze and use its intelligence to deduce certain information from that massive data, whether we're using it for NLP, using words, keywords to analyze a piece of written text, or whether we're using it to understand visual text. These are all things it does, but at the end of it, bringing back to what we said, it's a software based on algorithms predominantly to simplify. And until we start talking about superintelligence, which is a different AGI, which is a little different topic, it really is down to what it does. Even within that, there are these four ways of which we can think about what it can do. So reactive AI, which is most commonly think about. So whether it's a Google recommendation or a Spotify recommendation or a dating recommendation, they're all using those things. Then there's what we call limited memory AI, which is an observational system, really. It's actually learning from observation and from memory. And autonomous vehicles is a good example of that. Then there are those that are being developing. There's a theoretical mind, which is often in robotics now being used, which allows us to talk and have meaningful conversations with those types of robots that have awareness, and for us to make inferences, and for the robot too, based on our communication and conversation. And then finally, there's what we call self-aware, which are not obviously fully there yet, but that's the machines that actually, well, we're beginning to see, develop their own generative AI, right? As part of that. But generative AI is a little different to what we originally thought of as self-aware, where we talked about emotional and consciousness and cognitive aspects of AI. And that's one of the big areas we're all working on at the moment. And when you look at robotics, this is one interesting area because there are 7 to 10 main robots being developed simultaneously. There's a lot more those we talk about, and each of them has a different function. And so what we're seeing now within a lot of the robotics research is testing each functional area to perfection, to optimize on a singular robot. So not that a robot has everything. There's an interesting thing about robotics. I was talking to the Dr. Michal Pupin Institute in Belgrade, because they were one of the first institutes, certainly in Europe, to work on early stage humanoids. So humanoids are like the one you see in Dubai that welcomes you at the airport, stuff like that look like a human and were based on humans. And it's an interesting area because currently I'm told that we're roughly around 79% of perfecting a humanoid against a human. And those areas are really missing. There are some physical areas we're just finding difficult to actually achieve in running and stuff, but most of that will be, I'm sure, resolved. But it's still around the emotional AI areas, and that's part of that dream. That said, that's actually in a lab. And if you put it into real life, it'll be about 40%. So we're still quite a way away on some of these things. However, that's on the robotics side. On the pure AI side, as we've seen recently, incredible shifts in what we're doing. And obviously even a lot more talk about AGI, general intelligence. And that's the point at which AI surpasses the most gifted human minds and what we call the singularity. And Moravec and Kevin Warwick and Werner Range and Kurzweil and every sci-fi writer has covered that over the past few decades. And I'm sure you've seen all the online debates. There was a major one, I think, in 2017, where everybody thought it was so far away. And now it's become a popular topic again because because of OpenAI and the advances we've made in that area. And much of the time it's talked, oh, that won't happen this century. Oh, what's going to happen in 2045? Now it's, oh my God, let's stop developments because this could happen sooner than that. So, yeah, I suppose doesn't really need to be understood at its essence. It needs to be understood from its functionality and application and what it can do for us. That's more the point, I think, because actually trying to understand like for most people, how deep learning functions is not really terribly useful.
So, how would you categorize these different use cases? Obviously, there is the scientific definition of reactive machine AI, limited memory AI, theory of mind AI, and self aware AI that you mentioned. And I suppose there's the more generic, I would call it, definition of narrow intelligence, general intelligence, and super intelligence. But how would you categorize this based on the use cases, based on essentially what we can do with each of these technologies? When you're talking about, for example, between self-driving cars and robots to mobile phone.
They're based off of the four areas I was talking about as a way of achieving. It's everything that we do in terms of aiding either our memory to real, more specific uses in medicine, remote medicine, remote surgery, and things like that, to implants, to new communication systems. But I need to bring in maybe a topic here which I think is important, because AI on its own is one thing. AI, when we put it together with other technologies, is a very different thing. And I think that's the point really today. We'll come back on this a little later. But the transdisciplinarity that is currently, so some of the dangers, this is why people feel there are dangers to a certain degree. So what we're actually seeing is this accelerated risk or accelerated danger coming from the merging of nanotechnology, biotechnology, AI and robotics, neurotechnology, quantum computing, exocomputing, I suppose now, and particularly the neurosciences, because they've taken us to an area that we feel we know less about. But that becomes a very different area because, and that's where some of the worrying factors are, but where some of the most incredible opportunities are going forward in health, in manufacturing, like nanomanufacturing and stuff like that. These are areas AI, together with the other emerging, not even emerging anymore, growing technologies, those that we hear about more frequently, are providing us with very different forms of technologies and new applications and new possibilities that we've never thought about before. Over the years, I've done a lot of work with sci-fi writers, both from the cyberpunk side with people like Bruce Sterling and William Gibson, because from a long time ago, 30 years, I suppose, with Sterling, we used to be on panels together at South by Southwest and arguing with each other about all sorts of things, to people like Greg Bear, who recently deceased, who's much more what we call a hard sci-fi. He was actually a scientist by profession. And so much of his writings were pretty realistic. And so he and I would discuss both the sci-fi aspect of it, the crazy, but also the reality of this and how it can fit together. So a lot of that, why we say today, oh, well, this is all coming out of sci-fi, is because of the way that sci-fi writers work and whom they actually work with, that our imagination has just been blown away by not, and I want to make a point here, this is not just about technologies. I know we're talking a lot about technologies, but I mentioned at the very beginning, Steve, I'm as interested here in human development, even human singularity, which I'm sure you've heard me talk about, and the augmented human, which is my big thing, down to what environments we're working in. We've talked, I know you talked to me on occasions about smart cities and stuff, but how do they play into this? These are all these things come together. It's not like it's just the technology. Otherwise, we would have had VR back in 1995 when it was supposed to be in every household for Christmas. Here we are 30 years later, and it's in hardly any households. To be fair, these things are not simply driven by the technology. driven by that combination of human uptake, human adaptability, adoption, the environment in which, the context in which we're trying to make this happen, the economic value chain, of the whole thing, the law, the legal perspectives and the policies. Even interesting now, moratorium, 6-month moratorium on AI development. That's not even official, but you can imagine if it became official. And most of the time, in my view, the technologies advance irrespective of whether there's a moratorium or whether there's a law that's stopping it. Think of stem cells and stuff like that. Really, a whole variety of countries and scientists and places progressing, which is why I'm somewhat against a moratorium on AI. Can't, won't happen.
I really like that explanation. I think you touched on it perfectly. Is that it's categorized in this way, if I'm not mistaken, because it's not about the use cases and the sectors essentially that would use it. It's more that AI is a tool that you can leverage to do whatever you want with it. I want to touch on literally everything you talked about just now. So let's start with ChatGPT. It's the hottest thing to talk about right now. But in certain circles, definitely in yours and mine, AI has been a topic that's been discussed for a very long time, basically since 1950, as you were just saying. But I think really what has made it come to the fore for everyone, magnified its popularity, if you will, is the launch of ChatGPT. It's, I think, now the fastest growing social platform or app or whatever you would call it, beating Facebook, Instagram, and everything else. And so, overall, before we go into the moratorium and everything else you touched on, what are your thoughts on the work OpenAI has done on ChatGPT? And very importantly, how do you think this is catalyzing the work that other big tech companies are doing, like Google, like Meta, etc., to essentially fast track their investments and developments of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, mind blowing. And I think we all have to be a little honest. Yes, other than the people that actually probably worked on the people that invested in it. Why do I say that? Because you're always going to be, oh, well, we envisaged that. Yeah, but we all envisaged it. Generative AI is not a new thing. But the speed at which we arrived at that level of generative AI is pretty
It's
remarkable.
exactly,
And I'm not talking for the layman who still doesn't necessarily know what it is, right? Other than a line on the BBC News or something. But yeah, for all of us, in 2017 and 2018, I remember talking a lot about Zero, about DeepMind, about all the work that was happening with Go at the time, further iterations on that. And I remember in the interim between then and ChatGPT, there was a lot of debate on whether DeepMind was actually advancing, whether it actually was making any progress. It kept saying it was, just like we've heard so much about Google Brain and all the other systems. It kept saying, yeah, we're going to be coming out with this, we're going to be doing that. And there was a little bit of disbelief. It was a bit like reading Moravec back in the day on robots, 20 years. He's talking about third stage robots in 2018. And you're like, really? But then it happens. And then you're like, wow, that's crazy. And I think it took us by surprise. We have to all admit, I haven't spoken to Ray Kurzweil about it, maybe I should. But everyone I know, and I'm talking about scientists and my network in labs, yeah, in the last 3 months or 4 months, testing it, right, in some form, and getting their students to test it, testing it on multiple. I've tested it on probably 40 different potential use cases because you have to see what are the boundaries, what are the limitations, what's the accuracy level, how useful is it really, what is the level of fakeness together with the level of reality. It's only as good as the universal data that it's based on and its ability, which is a remarkable part about it, to actually perceive to a certain degree, reason, which we expect it to do, and actually come up with things that are pretty, generally speaking, pretty good. So I asked it to produce, for example, a 15-week course, multimedia course, media course, actually. And I gave it, whatever, 6 or 7 different ideas. And I asked for the reading list. And in whatever number of minutes, produce a 15-week course that was very logical. The actual theming of each of the weeks was really good. And some of the short detail was good. Obviously, it's not going to build all the content for me, but the outline, the syllabus, as a syllabus, was really good. The readings were more than useful. Yeah, some were obvious, some I'd never heard of. So I went to look at them. Some were useless, but some of them were outstanding. So that's one case. And I told you, I've probably done 50 or something. I got my students to use it in their final exam. I got them to write an analytical piece and then to take the inputs from their own piece and put them into ChatGPT and see what came up. And they were quite different, to be fair. Some of the human part was better and some of the GPT stuff was better, to be fair. And so, yeah, I mean, it's an issue in education because it's not even plagiarism because each piece is unique. That's why we're looking at all this, because it has so much meaning for so many areas. But yeah, I think it's extraordinary. GPT-4, which came out March the 14th, so less than a month ago, we've been playing with in the university. And that's supercharged, more accurate. This is what we're seeing so far. There's all this work going on, what's called memory GPT and auto GPT and all these other areas around this. There's so many developments at the moment. So how does this fit in? How is it going to be linked to the metaverse? How is it going to fit in with this technology? How's it going to fit in with this platform? And so on and so forth. And this is on its own is one thing, but it's collaboration or with others, or its fueling of other types of platforms and its ability to actually shift the way we think about investigative policing or things like that. That's quite remarkable, to be fair. The people that I'm talking to that are working with it, like Elizabeth Strickler, people like that, who are actually teaching it and getting their students to do lots of work with it, as I have been, that I think one would say are really trying to understand its breadth and depth and its ultimate application arena.
I'm guessing from your tone then an overall admiration of ChatGPT that you're not a fan of the moratorium. And just for clarity's sake, when we say moratorium, we're talking about the more than 1,000 experts that recently essentially signed an open letter saying they recommend or would be hopeful of a 6-month pause on a 6-month moratorium, if you will, on future development and investments on artificial intelligence while we have a better understanding of what it can do and set some guardrails ethically and in a regulatory sense. A lot of people point to Elon Musk, who is someone who is spearheading this effort while obviously having invested in OpenAI in the beginning and having companies like Tesla, SpaceX using technologies with AI, just not language models. What are your thoughts on this overall and the reason behind it? And also, what do you think is a better solution? Since obviously you don't agree with it, what would you say is a better solution?
Well, I've read all the debate, obviously, and continue
Mhm.
to read the debate because it's going on. I'm not one of the 1,000 people. I understand the logic. We've been having a discussion now for years on AI and ethics. There are ongoing teams, there are commissions, there's a European Commission working on it. There are experts from all fields all over the world working on it. And yes, occasionally we get some progress. There are actually, the EU has written up certain new rules to, and so, yeah, there are ways of dealing with this. And I think we're capable of monitoring and to a certain degree controlling the continuing development of generative AI without there being a moratorium. The slight irony in Elon Musk, of all people, given that he was one of the first investors in ChatGPT. And so I have this view here that A, I like to see things progressing at whatever speed they progress. Part of my whole life as a futurist, because I'm always trying to understand potential timelines. I'm always trying to understand, and I spend half my life talking to developers, designers, creators, inventors, patent developers, and so on and so forth, of understanding what they're doing really means, how it can be applied, how it can merge, how it can hybridize it, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I'm against stopping that, and you can argue whether that's progress or not progress. But I feel like it's too big an opportunity for people who are not party or even in agreement with the moratorium in any format, pressing ahead, as I mentioned earlier, as we saw with stem cells and everything else, and literally taking it to a level and gaining market benefits, so maybe dominance. Don't know, there's this bit within me, a bit between sour grapes, people who didn't actually manage to do it, and the other people who are like, oh my God, this
Right.
really could. We could end up with the singularity earlier. We could end up with really troublesome problems. Well, we can anyway.
Mhm.
This would be a bit like saying, okay, if we've got a moratorium on self-directed and created intelligence tools, why should we not then stop the development of molecular machines or self-assembly or I don't know, all these other processes that are going on, particularly within the medical profession and so on. There are so many new technologies going on.
Right. Where do you draw the line in the sand? Dang,
Exactly.
it's
As we've seen, I mean, a bit like, okay, 3D printing. Should I stop all 3D printing because 3D printing can now manufacture guns and synthetic drugs? And, I mean, no, but I can take anything pretty well, any of the developing technologies and even unthinkable technologies, which in the near future will be happening, and say, well, all of these should be stopped. No, I mean, let's not panic. Because 6 months from now, this is a question. Are we going to know any more 6 months from now? Yeah, we'll know a bit more. And yes, we can put in a black box equivalent so we can understand what it's doing and we can understand how to stop. But well, I haven't talked about AGI, but have we stopped developments in AGI? No, we haven't, have we? It's not something we've even thought about. In the last 20 years, there have been something like 80 actual platforms developed for AGI, of which about 49 are currently in use on something like 60 to 70 AGI projects. It's not like nothing's going on. It's just that we don't hear about it necessarily unless you're in the field or until something so dramatic happens. Now we're talking about generative AI in public. We're talking about generative AI for the last 30 years.
right.
So I'm not really pro this moratorium. Is my reasoning good or bad? Maybe it's gut feel. Maybe it's intuition, which is a big part of a futurist work.
And that's something you can't teach a machine. So that's a key thing.
Exactly.
I do want to touch on the ethics in more detail, but I think something that I hear a lot that we talked a little bit about is the fear mongering that surrounds AI, if you will. Some people are saying, oh, take a 6 month pause. But the argument I've heard from a few people in the industry is that they want a 6 month break on everyone else, but not themselves, while they work on their technology, their software, their whatever implementation model of AI, which of course everyone would deny. But more than that, the fear around AI, if you look at it more broadly, for quite a while now, has been around automation and essentially that it's coming for your jobs. This has been an ongoing point against technology and technological advancement for some time now. And while we've been talking about automation coming for delivery jobs, for cashiers, for truck drivers, Now, what we're talking about with ChatGPT is that no, it's actually coming also for copywriters and TV producers and lawyers to some degree and coders. What are your thoughts on what this means for the future of work? As I know you've done some work on this. And also, I want to hear on your thoughts regarding the use of AI to remove some of these gaps that are created because of AI, making use of the technology itself to remove the divide.
Okay. You mentioned the whole issue of jobs and so on. Of course, it's a concern. It's a concern anyway. It's not suddenly woken up in because of GPT or something. McKinsey and everybody else has done massive reports and massive research. They all have the figure between 40 and 50 or 40 and 60% the reduction in the workforce by 2030. But equally, if you look at the types of jobs, the number of new professions created between 2010 and 2020, it's hundreds of them. If we look at the new types of jobs being created now, and between 2020, 21, and 2030, yeah, the problem is the different types of skill needs, of which AI can actually help us considerably. It can help us in training, whatever, as can the metaverse and everything else that we're working on currently. HMR, human machine resources, is the shift to that from HR, and our ability to understand a better utilization of intelligent assets, us as human intelligence and machine intelligence, should not be considered as part of the same game, where we should be looking at job descriptions for machines as well as we do for humans, where we should be looking at allocation of machines and humans in parallel, or alternatively singularly, that they should be evaluated on potential performance, on costs, all the other things that we look at, effectiveness, efficiency, and so on, that we should be looking at functionality of the two. What is the best way of best bet? What's the best way of losing it? Projecting that over a period of time, whether it's short, medium, or long-term utilization. Maybe we don't invest now. We invest for the medium term for this or whatever. Right? These are all things that we have to understand. And yes, from a knowledge perspective, cobots and humans and machines are and will produce new forms of knowledge. They will be very imaginative. Yes, it seem like sci-fi to many of us. Yes, they will create completely new ways of thinking about stuff, which is perfectly okay, by the way. They will find ways around emotion, because we don't need to have, it's not all about the soul in everything that happens between the way we understand things emotionally or can react and communicate with one another. It's about whatever architecture, and I mean human architecture and machine architecture, permits that. So people are right from a neural perspective. We certainly don't about how memory works and how consciousness works. But then you can mimic that, you can simulate to get the same response. For example, I was watching a performance by a Georgia Tech robot musician. And the interesting thing about that robot musician is that well, it looks at you the whole time and it relates to you, and you really believe that it's, which is how it engages you with the performance, that it's human. And the way it does that is by using a camera and AI. Camera takes a microsecond shot of you and your emotion, and the AI analyzes that and sends back a mimicked reaction, physical reaction within the robot that makes you think it understands you and is with you and is smiling at you. We'll see it in so many ways, in so many different aspects, that it's just part of life. And we have to expect and accept. No one's complaining when they're using this that it got rid of a load of people who went around looking after telephone boxes, did it?
ATMs, right? ATMs, the
ATMs.
example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. This issue, maybe we talk about meta-economics and society 5.0 and the human development and our roles and how much we work and life work balance and everything else. Maybe there should be far more discussion on those areas than there is on maybe there's these completely new set of concierge jobs, which we've seen, right? Things growing and changing. Maybe we should be looking at the social, cultural development aspects that are running in parallel with this. And where can the new jobs come that underpin that for lesser creative or lesser educated, whatever, however we want to frame people that we think are going to lose their jobs. Yes, coders, I'm sure, are really unhappy because, yes, there is a likelihood that we won't need traditional coders anymore. But, there have been, in my lifetime, thousands of jobs that disappeared.
Right.
Yes,
Exactly.
right. That's just a fact of life. Actually, it's interesting if you go to developing countries because you see a lot of the things that don't exist as jobs in developed countries anymore. Maybe handmade shoes are a good thing, or tailors, or stuff that we just don't use anymore. So maybe this is an opportunity to shift some of the thinking, the cultural values. Maybe it's a question of redefining our overall human values in relationship to these developments. Maybe it's an opportunity rather than it being completely detrimental and killing everything. Maybe that's where the
Yeah.
thought should go rather than the other way around. That's a personal view, of course. But
I think it's about whether you're a glass half full or empty kind of person, isn't it? But I remember, I think it was the first lecture of yours that I ever heard 6 or 7 years ago. And you were talking about all the potential jobs that would exist essentially from AI and other developments in technology, emerging technologies. And I think that for every job that we will lose, we will at least, if not 10, gain one job back, let's say. So an AI assistant or a concierge or whatever else it might be. And what this really made me think of was a potential future where instead of people having jobs for the financial incentive for basically making money, we would actually simply work for the enjoyment and maybe betterment of society. So the AI or automation or whatever else takes care of the day-to-day basic needs of humanity, farming, whatever else, and we just do the more nuanced or human-centric work. I do think it's about the filter you use to look at the world, isn't it? Especially when it comes to technology, if you want to be afraid or if you want to be, hopeful.
yeah, it goes back to what I'm saying is there's too much emphasis on the detrimental aspects. And I don't mean the directly positive or negative aspects because that's easier to analyze. These are the benefits, but I'm thinking more from the adjacent impact areas. And some of those have nothing to do with technology, but they're to do with societal change, with environmental development, with policy, with how governments are run, and all these types of things, which are very different to just looking at the direct influences and direct impact. In many ways, we're trying to maintain the same societal structures, even though we know society is different. That's why we get frustrated because there's confusion, there's contradiction on every level, there's more fear because of jobs and all these things. And we know that society is changing and is different and transforming rapidly in front of our eyes. But in my view, we're not doing sufficiently to really shift those norms. And that's partly to do with who has control. Who has control over society, whether it's political systems or economic systems or whatever, the control mechanism. I think what's been interesting in the last decade or so has been the whole aspect of decentralization. So we talk about GPT, form being a decentralized tool, which it is, which is why we see the metaverse as a decentralized tool. And a lot of the arguments, these are similars, right? We've had within the EFF with Electronic Frontier Foundation, where we've been looking at frequencies, and we have to think about the back end of all this stuff, the architecture that's behind that. Right. The internet, who does it belong to? It belongs to us. We don't want to lose that. The metaverse, who does it belong to? We want it to belong to us. We don't want it to belong to Meta or anybody else. We want it to still belong to us, that we have that frequency as it developed, the actual distribution system, these communication systems are still with us, with the public. These are the aspects that we're concerned about is, GPT, all these things can get in the wrong hands. There's no question. A lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is looking at what it can do for criminals, of course. And we had all the issues because we weren't advanced enough on things like the dark web. And with the metaverse, we're looking at the deep verse, the dark verse, and all these other areas that are happening. Yes, generative AI does create an issue. It will create an issue around cryptography, particularly when you put it together with post-quantum cryptography and things like that. Yeah, no question. And no question we have to study it. Well, why can't we continue to study it? Why do we need to stop doing something to take time to study it? It's more to do with that. It's not that I'm actually not an ethical person or not worried about the ethics or not worried about the tragedy of all this. Millions of things I work with in Ministry of Interior. Can you think of how many worries that we have with all the new things that have happened over the last 2 decades? Of course, hundreds of them, from a drone to a damn IED that we've never heard of. But by the same token, there are so many positive things it can do. We've got to remember that.
You raise a great point, and I do want to expand on skills and education. But first, I think to step back, one of my points of intrigue, I suppose you would call it, is that despite the vast amount of information we have available to us right now, obviously with the internet, but ChatGPT and everything else, how much misinformation is out there. And I'm not really talking about disinformation and fake news and conspiracy theories and what have you, but people who refuse to accept basic accepted facts. And this can range from the extremes like the flat earth theory people to just having a debate where someone refuses to accept something that you could easily prove from looking at a scientific book or obviously Google. And to me, this extends now to ChatGPT and other generative AI, which, as we're seeing more and more, obviously, is prone to making mistakes, but being so confident with it, misstating the fact, but acting like it's a fact. And this can actually obviously worsen things because then people will take it for gospel and not go do more research. So, to some degree, obviously, it's about basic education. I remember one of the first things we learned in undergrad was how not to plagiarize, but more importantly, how to find good academic sources and respected articles and what have you. So, my question really is, how do you foresee things changing? Obviously, given your unique perspective as both an educator and someone who is actually working at the forefront of this technology, is AI going to be a force for good, if you will? Or is it just going to worsen this information divide or gap if people don't learn to differentiate between accurate and inaccurate or bad information?
I'll answer your question from the back forward because I am concerned about fake news and stuff like that. That's a totally different conversation. But the first part of this, so we're all within this framework of social engineering. So education comes into the other aspects you were talking about. Yes, you're right that as a professor, I should say no Wikipedia, and I should say absolutely no blogs. But you need to go to academia.com, wherever it is, Google Scholar or wherever, and pull
Right.
out some scientific article. And there's this interesting thing because I actually when I was writing my doctorate, I was older. So I was in a completely different place to the person who was 30 or whatever they are, 32. And by then I was really well established. I had a fantastic network of people. I was highly literate and I'd written books and papers and all sorts of stuff. And I was very aware of where I could search for information, of course, and build off of information as a futurist, because you're doing so much research that relates to things like weak signals and disruptions and all these types of things. You get used to scanning in a very different way, plus I had systems for scanning. So I used my scanning system. It was very different. The point was that when I broke it down by scientific articles and the 30 interviews I did with people who are actually driving this world, and whereby I could get first-hand direct information today rather than a paper that was written 2 or 3 years ago and just got published. Or I was looking at a paper from 2008 or something, which had a lot of validity to it, but needed to be seen in the context of what Clay Shirky or someone was talking about from social engineering. And what I realized that telling my students to not read blog was completely wrong. I knew that before, but the justification for it was because, yes, they should be careful which blogs they read, although I'm not the determinant of that, honestly. And I can recommend, because I'm teaching them the types of blogs they should read, which I think are as important as scientific papers. Now, there's always a debate, but I mentioned Clay Shirky, I could mention anybody, but all the people that I deal with all have blogs. That's part of the cause. Or alternatively, I would say, what? Go to Georgia Tech Expressive Machinery Lab and see what the heck they're doing, or go to MIT's, to Patty Mice or somebody, and see what her department's doing, because then you're going to be able to see the new things that are happening that are not yet written about, but are in development. And that's interesting. And so there are all these other ways of garnering that knowledge and information. And I do understand that we still need to maintain an academic resilience and whatever. I mentioned earlier that we, in a much different type of society, but I mentioned decentralization and these types of areas, and that's in everything, whether it's in thinking or whether it's in technological development or whatever.
Right.
We are now in a very different place whereby maybe that's frightening. It's frightening for corporations, that's for sure. Just like Uber was frightening for taxis. Airbnb was
Right.
frightening for hotel. So yes, we're in a situation whereby we're seeing a lot of bottom-up movement. And once something comes out, once people can analyze it or understand it, unless it's as good as Coca-Cola recipes, everyone's going to be hacking and doing it and changing it and playing with it. And see, I come from the perspective that's powerful cause, but I'm not sure that's how industrialists see it. So it goes back to what I said earlier. In this whole game, the issue is less around the technology and ethics and more around the power play and who has governance and who has the ultimate power. And that'll be the same with jobs in many ways, or any other area where we're seeing these massive changes and where AI is having a direct impact on societal change. It's a bit like companies who didn't want to bring in adaptive manufacturing or adaptive systems. From what happened, they found themselves miles behind, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to work out when it's viable to do so, when it's salient. So today, you'll see a piece of research. 97.3% of CEOs believe they need to have an adaptive manufacturing system. Of course, that's the way it is. Point about education, I actually personally advised a new learning system, which is based on the augmented learner and based on the combinations of foresight, multimedia learning, so pedagogical systems. And so, yes, I totally believe in that. I believe in certain aspects like bringing in transdisciplinary courses. If we're going to have transdisciplinary technologies, we need the humanities where does philosophy fit in? We need theory and philosophy to fit into mechanical engineering. We need material science to fit in with mechanical engineering or civil engineering. We need all these things to come together because ultimately, smart city, which I would think is a fantastic example of where all these things have to come together, is a real guideline for transdisciplinary learning, transdisciplinary courses, transdisciplinary syllabi. And so I work on that, and I've created a number of new courses over the years at different universities. And I think that's critical. And I think that when I look in that, there are areas we can work with, optimizing learner potential, much more work on learner analytics, a lot of aspects around self-managed environments. So whether that's a university per se, what's the future role of a university if there is one, the whole issue of blended learning, that. But more about co-creation, bringing machines, and I don't mean physical, it can be physical machines, cobots and stuff, but bringing in agents, AI agents, to work with me to create new knowledge. I think that's critical. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. Now, how we temper that or how we manage that within the pedagogical structure is for us to work out new pedagogical structures. We can't just say, no, you can't have that because it doesn't fit into the way we do tests and exams and whatever. That's pathetic. All these things have to run in parallel. And I think that part of this conversation is about when you break these things down individually, it's quite difficult to see an ecosystem in which they all function. But actually, everything we've talked about has to fit into a generative ecosystem as well, sociocultural, policy, environmental ecosystem at the same time. And that's being self-generated in a different way. Self-managed university or self-managed policing per se is a completely new structure, but certainly has a role to play and certainly has a whole possibility and potential behind it. And we see good examples of that, of robots in firefighting, all sorts of things. And AI now for security. We don't only use people for trying to track and crack and whatever. Investigation, we're using AI for investigation. We're using new forms of neuroscience together with neuroforensics. We had all the security area around cyber forensic, but now we're moving into new formats of forensics. And so really what's critical, I think, here is we need to stand back and look at the integrated ecosystem for all of this, rather than just say, well, AI has gone wild. Of course, it's gone wild within a more traditional ecosystem, but not necessarily if we see it from an overall decentralized ecosystem where it's par for the course.
I think that makes perfect sense. And that's a place for us to move away from the current technologies, I think, and move ahead a bit. But first, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.